There is a moment, near the end of this, where my sister is calling to me across the water and telling me to come to her, and I am walking the other way. I want you to hold that picture while I tell you the rest. A man, on a granite shore under a thin moon, 10,000 feet up, walking away from the sound of the one person left in the world who loves him, because she is begging him to come, and because that is exactly how he knows he must not. I have never told anyone what I traded that night to get us both down off that mountain. I am not sure even now that I got the trade I thought I was making, but I am going to take you back to the beginning, to the quiet part, before the radio, before the basin turned, when the worst thing between my sister and me was 11 years of saying nothing. Before we go up there, let me say hello properly. Welcome in. Whether you have been riding along with me for a while or this is your first cold night here, I am glad you came, and I do not take it lightly that you chose to spend this hour with me instead of sleeping. Do me one small kindness while we are still warm and the lights are still on. Down in the comments, tell me where you are listening from, your town and your country, and what the hour is on your clock right now. I read them. It steadies me, on a story like this one, to know how far the sound of it carries, and how many of us are awake out here together in the same long night. That is all I ask for now. Settle in. Here is how it started. There is a thing people get wrong about wild places. And they get it wrong because the getting of it right is unbearable. They think the mountains are indifferent to them. They say it the way you say a comforting thing. The mountain does not care, the river does not care, as if indifference were a kind of safety, as if a thing that does not care about you cannot hurt you. But indifference is not the truth of the high country, and it is not the comfort people think it is. Indifference would require the mountain to have noticed you first and then decline to feel anything. The truth is colder and simpler than that. The mountain has not noticed you. You are below the threshold at which it keeps any record at all. The wind that scours a man off a ridge is the same wind that would have blown if he had stayed home. The cold that stops his heart was already on its way down from the peaks before he was born. None of it is aimed. None of it is personal. You can spend a whole good life up there and mistake that for welcome, mistake the absence of malice for the presence of care, and most people do, and most people are lucky, and they go home and tell their friends that the wilderness gave them peace. But there is a second thing under the first thing, and you only learn it if you are unlucky, or if someone who loves you teaches it to you before the mountain has to. The second thing is this: the indifference is real, but it is not total, and it is not permanent. There are nights, in certain high lonely places, when something up there stops being indifferent to you. When the threshold drops, and you cross over it, and you are noticed. And the moment you are noticed, the only part of you that is of any use to the thing that noticed you is the part that wants to go home. That is the part it learns first. That is the part it learns to wear. My sister taught me that, years before I understood she was teaching me anything. We were sitting on the tailgate of a truck at a trailhead, and I had said something glib about how I could not see why anyone would be afraid of an empty forest. There was nothing in it. And she looked at me for a while and she said, "The part of you that wants out is the most dangerous thing you will ever carry into a place like this. So when you cannot tell which way is out, do not ask that part of you. It lies. It has always lied. It just usually lies about smaller things. Ask the water instead. The water has never wanted anything in its life. The water has never once been confused about which way is down." I thought it was a strange, sad thing for a person to believe. I did not understand that she was handing me the only key that would ever fit the lock. I put it in my pocket the way you pocket a thing a relative says, half listening, already thinking about something else. I want you to put it in your pocket too. You are going to need it before we are done, the same way I did. My sister Ren and I had not spoken, really spoken, in 11 years, and the reason was the kind of reason that sounds like nothing when you say it out loud, and weighs 1,000 pounds when you carry it. Our mother died when I was 9 and Ren was 17, and our father, who had been a forest ranger his whole life and was good at exactly one kind of love, the kind you perform by keeping a person alive and fed and warmed, became after that a man who could not be in a house. He took to the backcountry the way other men took to drink, and Ren, 17, raised me in the gaps he left, and she did it the way he did, by keeping me alive and fed and warmed, and never once by saying a soft word, because the soft words had gone into the ground with our mother and neither of them knew how to dig them back up. I held it against her for 20 years. I called it coldness. I told myself my sister did not love me because my sister never said she did. And when our father died and left her his old patrol cabin and his job near enough in a ranger district high in the Sierra, I told myself, good, let her have the mountains. The mountains were the only thing she had ever been able to love out loud. So when she called me that summer and asked, in the flat, careful voice that I had spent 2 decades resenting, whether I wanted to come up and spend a week at the cabin while she worked her patrols, I almost said no. I want to be honest about that. The thing that changed my mind was not warmth. It was that she said near the end of the call, after the logistics, in a smaller voice, "The cabin gets quiet," and then she did not say anything else, and I understood. The way you understand a thing your family will never say directly, that my sister was asking me for company and would die before she used the word. So I drove up. The cabin sat at the lip of a granite basin at 10,000 feet. A square of old logs and tin roof with a wood stove and a radio and a single window that looked out over a chain of alpine lakes stepping down the basin like coins spilled downstairs. Lodgepole pine and red fir where there was soil, bare scoured granite where there was not, and above it all the peaks, gray and indifferent and beautiful, holding the last snow in their shadowed couloirs even in August. The air was thin enough that I felt my own heartbeat for the first 2 days. Wren moved through that thinness like she had been born in it. She had our father's economy of motion, his way of never wasting a step, and watching her I felt the old resentment and something else under it that I did not have a name for yet. She showed me the cabin the way she would have briefed a new seasonal, which is to say without sentiment. Here is the stove, here is the water, here is the radio. You do not touch the radio. And here by the door are the rules. The rules were on the back of the door, on a slab of weathered pine that had clearly hung there for longer than my sister had been alive. They had been written on and over and around by many different hands across many years, in pencil and in grease pen, and in the kind of waterproof marker that rangers carry. Some of the lines faded almost to the grain of the wood, some sharp and recent, the whole thing layered like the rings of a tree, like a thing that had been added to by every person who had ever wintered in or patrolled out of that cabin and survived to write a line. I stood and read them while Wren made coffee, and I read them as a curiosity, a piece of mountain folklore, the way you read the carved names in an old shelter. I did not read them as instructions. That was my first mistake, and it was a small one, and the mountain is patient with small ones, right up until it is not. This is what the board said, in its many hands, top to bottom, oldest to newest. 1. Trust the water before you trust your feet. The water has never been confused about which way is down. 2. If you are alone when the sun goes behind the ridge, do not go looking for the trail. Sit down where you are standing and wait for the light. The trail will be exactly where you left it. You are the thing that will have moved. 3. Count the far lake. If the far shore is nearer on the way back than it was on the way out, the basin has turned. Do not walk on. Go back to the water and follow it down, no matter how wrong down feels. 4. The radio is for facts. It is not for company. If it ever offers you company, set it down and walk away from it and do not pick it back up until the sun is up. 5. One fire is yours. Never build the second fire. And never walk toward a second fire that you did not build, even if you can see people sitting at it. 6. If you are out at night and your own shadow falls toward the moon instead of away from it, you are being shown a lie. Shut your eyes. Walk by memory. Your eyes are no good to you once the shadow turns. 7. Do not finish another person's sentence out here, not even your own blood's. Make them finish it themselves. The ones who cannot finish their own sentences were never the ones who started them. 8. Count your party at the trailhead. Count them again at the truck. The number that climbs into the truck is the number that is real. If the counts do not match, do not drive. Sit and wait for the light and count once more. I read all 8, and I laughed, not unkindly, and I asked Wren whether the Forest Service knew its rangers were running a haunted house up here. She did not laugh. She set my coffee down in front of me, and she looked at the board for a moment with an expression I could not read, and she said, "Every line on that board was written by someone who needed the next person to know it. That is all I will say about it." And then she changed the subject to whether I had brought a warm enough bag. because the nights got down near freezing even in summer, and I let her change it, because that was how we talked, my sister and I. We changed the subject. We had been changing the subject for 11 years. That first evening, before the dread, before any of it, we sat on the cabin step and watched the light go long and gold across the basin. And she told me, almost despite herself, the one piece of Ranger lore she seemed to actually fear, and I did not know yet that she was loading the gun that would go off at the end of everything. She nodded out at the lakes, going to hammered metal in the low sun, and she said, "You know what the worst thing up here is, and it is not the cold and it is not the falls." She said the old Rangers had a word for it, a thing that happened maybe once in a career, in certain basins, on certain nights, when the air did something they did not understand and the country, she said, went inward. I asked her what that meant, went inward, and she was quiet, choosing her words the way she chose her steps, and she said, "It is when out stops existing, when every direction you can walk feels like the way out, and every one of them takes you deeper in. When the basin folds itself around you so that the trail and the truck and the whole rest of the world are behind a door that has quietly stopped being there," she said. "The only ones who walk out of a turned basin are the ones who stop trusting the way out feels, and start trusting the things that cannot lie. The water, the shadows, if you read them backward." And then she stood up and brushed off her trousers, and said it was probably nothing, an old story, she had only felt the edge of it once and it had passed, and she went in to bank the stove, and I sat out a while longer and watched my own long shadow lie down across the granite, pointing east, away from the dying sun, exactly where a shadow is supposed to point, and I thought no more about it. I should have asked her, that night, what she traded the time she felt the edge of it. I did not. We had 11 years of not asking sitting between us, and I was not going to spend my first night dismantling it. I let her go in. That is the thing I would take back, if the mountain let you take things back, which it does not. I let my sister carry that one alone for one more night, the way we had let each other carry everything alone. And the next day they called her out. And after that there was no more time for the questions you are supposed to ask the people you love, while the asking is still cheap. The call came over the radio on the third morning, and it was the kind of call my sister could not say no to, which is the only kind the mountain ever sends to separate you from the people you need. A pair of backpackers were overdue out of the next basin north, a day and a half late, and the weather was turning, a fast cold front dropping down out of the high peaks, and the district was short-staffed the way it is always short-staffed now, and Wren was the closest ranger to the saddle the hikers would have crossed. I listened to her on the radio, flat and competent, copying coordinates, and I watched the person I had spent 11 years calling cold become, in the space of 2 minutes, a person organizing strangers across 40 miles of mountains to go save two people she had never met. And I felt the thing under my resentment shift again and start, finally, to come loose. She packed in 10 minutes. She was good at it, the economy again. Our father's economy. And in those 10 minutes a strange thing happened between us. The first soft thing in 11 years. And it happened the way soft things happened in our family, which is to say sideways, disguised as something practical. She was clipping her radio to her pack strap, and she stopped, and she unclipped it, and she pressed it into my hands instead. "The base unit stays here," she said, "but I want you to keep this one on you. Channel is set." And then, instead of letting go of it, she held it a second longer, both our hands on the radio, and she said, not looking at me, "If anything feels wrong while I am gone, you call me, and you do exactly what I say, and you do not argue with me the way you have argued with me your whole life." And I said something glib. I do not even remember what, because that was my move, the glib thing, the change of subject, and she did not take it. She held the radio, and held my eyes for once, and she said, "Jonah, just this once. Trust me before you trust yourself." And there it was, our father's whole philosophy of love. Trust me before you trust yourself. The only way either of them had ever known how to say "I am afraid for you." And I heard it finally, at 36 years old. I heard what it had always meant, and my throat did a thing that made the next word come out smaller than I had planned it. "Okay," I said. "Okay. Just this once." She almost smiled. My sister, who I had told myself for 2 decades did not love me, almost smiled. And she shouldered her pack, and she went. And I stood in the cabin doorway and watched her cross the basin in the flat morning light, getting smaller against the granite, until she went over the lip of the saddle and the mountain took her, and the last of her was the small bright point of her pack disappearing. And then the basin was mine, and it was very quiet, and the quiet was, for those first hours, an ordinary quiet, the good kind, and I had no way of knowing it was the last ordinary quiet I would ever have. I spent that day the way you spend a day alone at altitude. Slowly, I read. I watched the front build over the peaks, towers of gray cloud stacking up and spilling down the couloirs. I checked the radio twice and heard my sister's voice both times, far off and businesslike, working her way toward the overdue hikers, and both times the ordinary sound of her steadied me. The cold front came in around 4, and the temperature fell hard, and the wind came up, and the light went from gold to a flat pewter that flattened the whole basin and erased the shadows, and the lakes went from coins to slabs of slate, and I went inside and banked the stove and felt, for the first time, the specific loneliness of a high place when the weather closes the sky down over it like a lid. I am going to step out of the story for one breath here, because we have come to the edge of the part that I do not like to tell. And you have come with me this far into a cold, dark place on a night you could have spent doing anything else, and I notice, the way you notice a small, honest thing, that you have not yet pressed the like on this, or left so much as a word below to say you are here in the cabin with me while the front comes in. It is a small thing and a warm thing, and it costs you nothing, and it is the kind of thing my sister would have done sideways, disguised as something practical, so let me say it plainly instead. The way she taught me to say the things that matter. I would be glad to know you are here. Press the like, leave a word, and then come sit by the stove with me, because the radio is about to do something it should not be able to do, and I do not want to be alone when I tell it. At 9 that night, with the wind working at the tin roof and the stove ticking and the one window gone black with weather, the radio crackled, and my sister's voice came out of it, and said my name. Jonah? The radio said, in Wren's voice. Jonah. Are you there? I had the handset to my mouth before I had finished standing up. Relief is a kind of stupidity. I was so glad to hear her that I forgot, completely, the fourth rule on the board behind me. The radio is for facts, it is not for company. And I forgot it because I was lonely and the wind was loud and my sister's voice was the warmest thing in 40 miles of stone. I am here, I said. I am here. Are you okay? Did you find them? And she said, and this is the first place the cold got into me. Under the relief, like water under a door, she said, I am so glad to hear your voice. I want you to understand why that sentence stopped my hand on the handset. In 36 years, my sister had never once told me she was glad to hear my voice. She did not have the equipment for it. She showed me she was glad I existed by checking my pack straps and telling me my bag was not warm enough and pressing her radio into my hands. The words, the bare, soft words, were the precise thing our family did not do. The thing our father took into the ground, the thing 11 years of silence had been built out of. And here was my sister's voice, exact, the timbre of it, the flatness even, saying the soft thing easily, saying it like it was nothing. I am so glad to hear your voice, and the wrongness of it was so specific and so quiet that for a moment I could not name what was wrong. I only felt the warmth in the cabin change temperature, felt my own glad smile stiffen on my face without my deciding it should. I said, carefully, where are you? Did you find the hikers? And she said, I found them. They are fine. We are coming back over the saddle now. But the front is bad, Jonah. The trail down is bad, and I need you to do something for me. I need you to come meet us. I need you to come out to the far lake, the big one at the bottom of the basin, and bring the spare headlamps and the rope from the cabin. And come now, because we are hurt and we are slow and we cannot make the cabin in this wind without help. It was a good lie. I want to give it that. It was a lie built to use the exact thing my sister had just unlocked in me. The thing that had come loose watching her organize a rescue. The part of me that had spent 11 years wanting to be of use to her, and being told sideways to stay out of the way. It reached straight into the new soft place and pulled. Come now, we are hurt, I need you. Every part of me that wanted to finally be the brother she could count on stood up and reached for the rope, and the second rule stopped me. If you are alone when the sun goes behind the ridge, do not go looking. Sit down where you are. You are the thing that will have moved. It surfaced in my head in the layered ranger hands of that pine board. And it sat there against my sister's voice, and I stood in the middle of the cabin with the rope already half in my hand, torn, the wind working the roof. And I did the thing she had asked me to do that morning with both our hands on the radio. I tried, just this once, to trust her before I trusted myself. And trusting her meant remembering that the real Wren, the careful one, the one who briefed me like a seasonal, the one who wrote "do not go looking" on a board and meant it, would never ever, in a turning front at night, tell her untrained brother to come out alone across a basin to find her. The real Wren would tell me to stay put and keep the stove going and wait for the light. The thing on the radio was using her voice to tell me to do the one thing my sister would have crossed the mountain to stop me from doing. So I did the seventh rule. I did not know I was doing it. I only knew I needed to be sure, and that I could not bear to be sure, and that there was one way to find out that did not require me to believe or disbelieve my own frightened ears. Do not finish another person's sentence out here. Make them finish it themselves. I keyed the handset, and I made my voice as ordinary as I could, and I said, "Okay, I am coming, just tell me, before I lose you, the thing Dad used to say. Say the thing Dad always said before you go quiet on the radio. I will come right now, just say it first." There was a silence. Not a long one. A heartbeat too long. And then the radio said, in my sister's warm and glad and lying voice, it said, "I love you, little brother. Come to me." And that is how I knew, because our father never said "I love you." Not once, not to either of us, not on the radio or off it. The thing our father always said before he signed off, the thing Wren had said to me in his exact cadence 1,000 times without ever once noticing she was quoting him, the thing the real Wren would have produced without a half-second of thought because it lived in her body below the level of choosing, was 4 flat, unsentimental words. Keep your feet dry. That was it. That was our family's whole vocabulary of love. Keep your feet dry. Trust me before you trust yourself. Your bag is not warm enough. The soft words were the tell. The thing on the radio knew that my sister loved me. It had heard it in my voice, in my relief, in my readiness to come. What it did not have, what it could not have, because we had never once spoken it aloud for it to steal, was the specific dialect of our particular damaged love. It reached for "I love you" because that is what love sounds like to a thing that has only ever heard love from the outside. And my sister and I had never said "I love you" in our lives. I set the handset down on the table, very gently, the way you set down something that might go off. My hand was not steady. The voice was still coming out of the radio, warmer now, more urgent. "Jonah, Jonah, why did you stop talking? I am hurt. Please come, please." And it was perfect. It was her. It was exactly her. And it was saying please, and my sister had never said please to me in her life. And I picked the radio up off the table, and I walked it across the cabin, and I set it down on the floor in the far corner, facing the wall, the way the 4th rule said. Set it down and walk away. And I sat on the floor on the other side of the room with my back against the wood stove and my knees pulled up, and I listened to the thing that was wearing my sister beg me to come and die, for hours, until the wind took the worst of it, and I did not answer, and I did not move. And somewhere out in the turning night my real sister was, I had to believe, sitting down where she stood, waiting for the light, exactly as the board said. Exactly as she had taught me, the two of us obeying the same dead rangers from opposite sides of a basin that was quietly all around us, beginning to fold. I made it to first light, and first light betrayed me. And the way it betrayed me is the only part of this I am ashamed of, because it was not the mountain that broke the rule. It was love. It was the oldest, most human thing there is. And I would do it again, and that is the worst part, that I would do it again. When the gray came up in the window and the wind finally died, the voice on the radio in the corner had long gone silent, and the cabin in the dawn looked ordinary and stupid and safe, and the terror of the night looked, in that flat morning light, like the overactive imagination of a man alone at altitude who had spent too long reading a haunted board. That is what daylight does. It launders the night. It tells you the reasonable story, and the reasonable story was that my sister, exhausted and hurt and shepherding 2 frightened strangers through a brutal front, had radioed her brother for help and said, in her exhaustion, an unguarded soft thing for the first time in her life. And her brother, half mad with old grudges and ghost stories, had left her out there all night, alone, in the cold, and sat on the floor and let her beg. That is the story the morning told me. And here is the thing I need you to understand. The thing that makes it not a ghost story, but a story about my sister and me. I had spent 11 years being certain my sister did not love me, and being wrong. I had just spent a night being certain the thing on the radio was not my sister. And the symmetry of it reached up out of the dawn and took me by the throat. What if I was wrong again? What if the one time my sister finally said the soft thing? Finally said please? Finally reached out across all that silence and asked her brother for help? Her brother had decided she was a monster and let her freeze. The rule said wait for the light. The light was here, and the part of me that wanted out of that cabin, the part that wanted to find my sister and be wrong about her one more time and be forgiven for it. That part of me stood up off the floor, and it did not feel like fear. It felt like love. It felt like the bravest and most decent thing I had ever done. I took the rope and the spare headlamps, and I went out to find her. I broke the second rule. Do not go looking. I broke it for the best reason a person can break a rule. And the mountain does not grade on reasons. The basin in the early light was still and cold and beautiful, and the front had left a skin of new snow on the high granite. And I went down toward the chain of lakes calling her name, which I should not have done. The eighth thing my sister had not gotten to. Names are not free up here, but I did not know that, and I called Wren, Wren across the water, and the basin gave me back my own voice off the granite walls. Thinned and strange, I went down to the first lake, and along its shore toward the far lake, the big one at the bottom, the one the voice had told me to come to, because some part of me, the part that wanted to be wrong, was going there anyway, was going to the place the lie had named, because the lie had warned my sister and I could not stop my feet from following her even knowing. And it was at the far lake that I remembered the third rule, and understood, far too late, that it was not folklore. Count the far lake. If the far shore is nearer on the way back than it was on the way out, the basin has turned. I had walked out to the far lake along its near shore, and the far shore had been a good half-mile off across the water, a clear half-mile. I had marked it without thinking, a dead snag on the far point, and when I turned to start back toward the cabin, the far shore was close. The dead snag on the far point was 100 yards away. The lake had not moved. The water had not moved. The thing that had moved was the distance itself, the basin folding quietly while my back was turned, the half-mile of water shrinking to 100 yards, and I stood on that shore in the new snow, with the rope in my hand, and I felt the ground of the world come unmoored under me, felt out stop existing, felt the basin go, in my sister's word, inward. I am going to tell the next part as plainly as I can, because it is the part where everything she taught me came due, all at once, and I lived or died by whether I had been listening on the tailgate of a truck 11 years before when I thought I was only half listening. The basin had turned, and I could feel it now that I knew to feel it. The wrongness in every direction. The way each path back toward the cabin presented itself as obviously correct, as clearly the way out, the trail right there, the cabin surely just over that rise, and the third rule and my sister's voice from the tailgate both telling me that the feeling of out was the lie, that the part of me that wanted out was the part the basin had learned, was the part it was using now to walk me deeper in. Every cell in my body wanted to walk toward the cabin, and the cabin, I understood, was the bait. The direction that felt like home was the direction that would fold me away into the center of the turned basin and never give me back. Trust the water. Ask the water. The water has never been confused about which way is down. I went to the edge of the lake and I found the outlet, the place where the lake spilled over its lip and ran down toward the next lake and the next, down the staircase of the basin toward the trailhead and the truck and the world. And I made myself do the thing that felt insane, the thing the wanting part of me screamed against. I turned my back on the direction that felt like out, and I followed the water down, even though down felt wrong, even though down felt like walking deeper into the mountain, because the water could not lie about down. The water had never wanted anything. The water was the one thing in the turned basin that the thing could not wear. And as I went down along the water, against the pull, the night came back. Not night by the clock. The basin pulled its own night down over me, the light going from morning to a thin moonless gloom in the space of minutes, the sky folding shut. And I walked the outlet stream down through the failing light with the rope still stupidly in my hand, and the thing came with me. I could not see it. I want to be clear about that, because the not seeing is the truth of it. I never once saw it whole. I only ever saw what it did to the world around it. It came with me down the water, on the far bank, keeping pace, and it began, again to use her voice, out of the gloom, across the stream, Wren's voice, calling me, telling me I was going the wrong way, telling me the cabin was back the other way, telling me to cross the water and come to her, pleading, please, Jonah, please, you are walking away from me. Why are you walking away from me? And it was the worst sound I have ever heard because it was exactly my sister, and it was saying the one thing that was almost certainly true, that somewhere I was walking away from her, and I did not know. I will never know whether the real Wren was also out there in that turned basin calling me and I walked past her in the gloom following the water down. That is the trade I told you about at the start. That is the impossible thing. To get out of a turned basin, you must walk away from the way that feels like out. And the thing knows this, so it puts the voice of the person you love on the side that feels like out, and it makes that voice beg, and you have to decide that you are willing to walk away from your own sister calling your name in order to maybe save her, that you are willing to be the man who abandoned her if it means being the man who lived to come back with help. And there is no way to know, in the moment, in the gloom, with her voice cracking across the water, which kind of man you are being. I chose the water, God forgive me, I chose the water over her voice. I kept the stream on my right and I walked down and I did not cross and I did not answer. And the voice followed me, and broke and pleaded, and then, near the end it did the last thing. The thing that almost turned me even then. My own shadow appeared on the snow ahead of me. There was no light to cast it. The basin was moonless and gray. But there was my shadow, long and thin on the snow in front of me, and it was pointing the wrong way. A shadow falls away from the light. There was no light, and what light the sky held was behind the clouds at my back, which meant my shadow should have fallen ahead of me. And it did. It fell ahead of me, and then, while I watched, it turned. It swung around on the snow like the needle of a compass, and it pointed back, up the basin, toward the voice, toward the way that felt like out, my own shadow turning to point me toward the lie. The sixth rule came up through me cold and complete. If your shadow falls toward the moon, you are being shown a lie. Shut your eyes. Walk by memory. Your eyes are no good to you once the shadow turns. And I shut my eyes, there in the turned basin, with my sister's voice begging me out of the gloom and my own shadow betraying me on the snow. I shut my eyes and I put my hand out, and found the cold of the stream, and I walked down blind, one foot and then the other, the water loud and honest on my right, my eyes squeezed shut against a world that had started lying with light itself, and the voice followed me down begging the whole way. And I did not open my eyes, and I did not cross the water, and I walked out of that basin blind, by memory, and by the sound of the one thing in the world that had never wanted anything from me. I do not know how long. I came out of the gloom into ordinary dusk the way you come up out of deep water, all at once, the pressure gone, the sky simply a sky again, an ordinary evening sky over an ordinary basin, the lake stepping down in front of me toward the dark line of the trailhead trees, and the voice was gone. And my shadow lay quiet and correct on the snow behind me, pointing away from the last light in the west, where a shadow is supposed to point. And I was standing at the bottom of the basin, a quarter mile from the truck, with the rope still in my hand, and tears frozen on my face, and no idea, none, whether my sister was alive or dead, whether I had saved her or left her, whether the begging voice had been the thing the whole time, or whether, for one stretch of it, in the gloom, it had been her. Wren walked out of the trees at the trailhead an hour after I did. I was sitting on the tailgate of her truck in the last light, shaking, when she came down off the saddle trail with the two backpackers behind her. all three of them exhausted and cold and entirely alive, and she crossed the lot to me. And she was the real one. I knew she was the real one, because the first thing she did was not embrace me. The first thing she did was look at my hands and say, "Where are your gloves? You are going to lose fingers." And the relief of being scolded, the plain unsoft relief of it, undid me completely, and I put my face in my frozen hands and I wept. And my sister stood next to me, not touching me, which is how I knew. And after a while she put one hand flat between my shoulder blades just once, the way our father used to, and left it there, and that was the most she had ever given me, and it was everything. She had felt it too, up in the North Basin. She told me later, in the truck, in the careful flat voice, that the front had turned the saddle basin around her near midnight, that she had felt it go inward, and that she had done what the board said, sat down where she stood with the two terrified hikers and waited for the light and refused to let any of them walk toward the way out no matter how it called, and that she had heard things in the gloom, in voices she would not name to me, and had not answered them. We had been doing the same thing all night, she and I, obeying the same dead rangers from opposite sides of the mountain. I did not tell her then that one of the voices I refused had been hers. I have never told her. I do not know how to tell her that I stood on a shore and listened to her beg me to come and walked the other way, even though it saved us, even though it was right, because there is no version of that sentence that does not also say I was willing to leave you. And you do not say that to the person who raised you. You do not hand them that. We counted the party at the trailhead. 5. Ren, the two hikers, me, and the other ranger who had driven up to meet us. Ren counted us out loud at the trailhead the way the 8th rule said, and again at the trucks, and the counts matched, 5 and 5. And she nodded, satisfied. And that should have been the end of it. We got in the trucks and we drove down out of the mountains, my sister and I in hers, the heater roaring, the peaks going gray and then black in the mirrors. And I should have felt only the enormous clean relief of a person who has come down off a mountain alive with the last of his family beside him. Here is why I do not. We were an hour down the mountain, on the long dark grade toward town. The two of us quiet in the cab in the way that was, for the first time in 11 years, a comfortable quiet, an earned one. When my sister reached over without looking and put her hand on my arm and she said, easily, warmly, the way a person says a thing that lives in their body below the level of choosing, she said, "I am so glad you came up, Jonah. I love you, little brother." And I have not been able to breathe right since, because my sister does not say that. My sister has never said that. The soft words went into the ground with our mother, and neither she nor our father could ever dig them back up. And that was the whole tragedy and the whole language of our love. And the one time I had heard those exact words in my sister's voice, "I love you, little brother," they had come out of a radio in a cold cabin, from a thing that had learned that love sounds like that to people who have only heard it from the outside. The tell, the soft words were always the tell. And now they were coming out of the woman driving me down the mountain, the woman who scolded me about my gloves, the woman who put one flat hand between my shoulders because she could not make her arms do more. The real one, the one I knew, saying the thing the real one could not say, saying it easily, warmly, please. The way the thing in the gloom said please. I told myself it was the mountain. I told myself a person can change, that a night like that can crack something open in even the most closed person. That my sister had looked into the turned basin and come down able finally to say the thing. And that this was a gift and not a horror, that the most frightened part of me was doing again exactly what it had done for 11 years, calling love coldness, calling warmth a lie, refusing my sister the simple grace of having grown. I told myself the thing she taught me on the tailgate, that the part of you that wants out is the dangerous part, the part that lies. And I understood, sitting in that warm cab, that the wisdom had turned all the way over on me. Because now the part of me that wanted out, that wanted to be free of the doubt, that wanted to simply believe my sister loved me and had said so and be home, that wanting part was the loudest thing I carried, and she had taught me herself, never to trust the part of you that wants out. So I did the only thing I had left. I did the 7th rule, one last time, in the warm cab, on the dark grade, with my sister's hand on my arm. I made my voice ordinary and I said, "Say the other thing, Ren. The thing Dad always said, before you go quiet. Say it for me." And my sister took her hand off my arm, and she put it back on the wheel. And she was quiet for a moment, watching the road come up out of the night. And then she said, flat and unsentimental, in our father's exact cadence, "Keep your feet dry, Jonah." Which is right. Which is exactly right. Which is the thing the radio could not say, the thing only the real one could know, the proof, the all clear, the words that mean it is her, it was always her, you are safe, you brought your sister down off the mountain and she loves you and she said so and now she has proven she is real, and I should have wept again with the relief of it, but she had already said the other thing first. She had said, "I love you, little brother," easily, the way the thing in the gloom said it, before I asked her to prove herself. She said the tell, and then, when tested, she passed the test. And I have lain awake every night since turning it over, because there are only two ways to read it, and I cannot choose between them, and I will not be able to for the rest of my life. Either my sister came down off that mountain finally able to love me out loud, and also, separately, still carries our father's words, and both things are true, and she is simply wholly my sister, changed and whole and real. Or the thing learned. The thing stood across the water from me in the turned basin and heard, in the way I refused it, exactly which words were the tell and exactly which words were the proof. And it walked down out of the gloom an hour behind me wearing the lesson, and it knows now to say the soft thing first and the true thing second. And it is sitting beside me in the cab, driving me home, and it has my sister's hands, and it told me to keep my feet dry. We are home now. It has been 3 years. She is, by every test the world can give me, my sister. She scolds me about my gloves. She does not embrace me, and every so often, less often than at first, she reaches over and says, easily, warmly, that she loves me. And every time she does, I smile, and I say it back, and I have not, in 3 years, been able to make myself ask her to finish another sentence. Because the board said make them finish it themselves. The ones who cannot finish their own sentences were never the ones who started them, and my sister can finish every sentence I give her now. She never misses, not once. And I do not know anymore whether that means I brought the real one down off the mountain, or whether it only means that whatever came down in her place has simply in 3 patient years finished learning how to be her. So I do not ask. I let her say she loves me. I have wanted, my whole life, to hear my sister say she loves me, and now she says it, and that is the trade the mountain made me after all. The one I did not understand I was making when I chose the water over her voice. It gave me back a sister who can say the words. And it took, in exchange, my ability to ever again be sure who is saying them. Keep your feet dry. That is what our father always said. I say it to her now, sometimes, just to watch her face when she hears it. She always smiles. She always says it back. She has never once gotten it wrong. The mountains had always called to me. Since childhood, I'd found solace in the vastness of untamed landscapes, places where human footprints disappeared with the changing seasons and where silence had genuine weight. By my late 20s, these wilderness excursions had evolved into a ritual, one I shared with 3 close friends from college, Jackson, Will, and Bennett. Together, we'd traversed countless trails across North America, from the mist-shrouded paths of the Appalachian Trail to the sun-baked ridges of the Grand Canyon. Our annual hiking trips had become sanctuary from our increasingly complicated lives. We were no longer the carefree college students who could disappear into the backcountry for weeks at a time. Now we had careers, mortgages, and relationships that demanded our presence. These expeditions had become precious interludes, brief returns to a simpler existence. June 2017 marked our planned journey to Yellowstone National Park. I remember checking the weather forecast obsessively in the days leading up to our departure, anxiety building as I watched thunderstorm warnings flashing across my screen. The others had laughed at my meteorological fixation during our video call the night before departure. Weather changes every 15 minutes in the mountains, Jackson had said, his beard now flecked with premature gray. We've hiked through worse. He wasn't wrong. We'd endured blizzards in Colorado and flash floods in Arizona. Weather was as much a part of the wilderness experience as blisters and granola bars. Yet something about this trip felt different before it had even begun. A heaviness had settled in my chest, like the atmospheric pressure drop before a violent storm. Will had noticed my uncharacteristic quiet during that call. "Getting cold feet, buddy? We can always hit a resort instead. Room service, hot tubs, overpriced cocktails." His attempt at levity had worked, momentarily dispersing the inexplicable dread I'd been feeling. "And miss the opportunity to smell your unwashed hiking socks for 4 days? Not a chance," I'd retorted, falling back into our familiar patterns of banter. Bennett, always the most practical of our group, had interrupted our exchange with logistics, departure times, gear checklists, emergency contacts. His methodical nature had saved us more than once over the years, though we'd never admit it to his face. None of us could have anticipated what awaited us in Yellowstone's remote backcountry. The memories of that trip have embedded themselves in my psyche like shards of glass, impossible to extract without causing further damage. Even now, 7 years later, certain sounds or scents can instantly transport me back to those mountains, to the moment when our understanding of wilderness, and perhaps humanity itself, fundamentally changed. I've struggled with whether to document what happened, whether giving form to these memories might somehow intensify their hold on me. But perhaps confronting them is the only path forward. So I'll begin where all nightmares begin. With an ordinary day, unremarkable in every way except for what would follow. We arrived at Yellowstone's eastern entrance shortly after dawn, having driven through the night in Bennett's aging but reliable SUV. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine and mineral-rich soil as we shouldered our packs and checked our GPS coordinates one final time before losing reliable signal. Our destination was a remote alpine lake, nestled approximately 18 miles from the nearest marked trail. The isolation was precisely what had drawn us to this particular location, the promise of pristine wilderness untouched by the typical Yellowstone crowds. According to satellite imagery and topographical maps, the lake sat at roughly 7,200 feet, surrounded by peaks that soared well above 10,000 feet. "Perfect weather for a death march," Will remarked dryly, squinting at the cloudless sky as we began our trek. The first several miles followed an established trail, where we occasionally encountered other hikers, nodding acknowledgments as we passed. By early afternoon, we'd reached our divergence point, where we would leave the marked path and begin navigating by compass and topographical features. "Last chance to turn back," Bennett said, though we all knew it was mere formality. None of us would suggest abandoning our plans this early. The terrain grew steadily more challenging as we pushed further from established routes. What had begun as a gentle incline transformed into steep switchbacks that forced us to use our hands for balance, grasping exposed tree roots and jutting rocks. Our conversation dwindled to occasional grunts and necessary directional calls. By late afternoon, our shirts clung to our backs with sweat, and our legs burned with the effort of the climb. But the scenery rewarded our exertion. Vast expanses of untouched wilderness stretched in every direction, with distant mountains cutting sharp silhouettes against the deepening blue sky. "There," Jackson pointed toward a depression between two ridgelines. "Should be just beyond that next rise." We arrived at the lake just as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. The water stretched before us, mirror still and reflecting the surrounding cliffs in perfect detail. It was smaller than we'd anticipated, perhaps half a mile across at its widest point, but undeniably beautiful. "Worth every blister," Will declared, already shrugging off his pack. We established camp on a relatively flat section of shoreline, each falling into our well-practiced roles. Jackson filtered water while Bennett assembled our portable stove. Will and I erected the tents, strategically positioning them to shield against the wind that would inevitably sweep down from the peaks after nightfall. As darkness descended, we gathered around our small cook stove, passing a flask of whiskey while our freeze-dried meals rehydrated. The conversation flowed easily, covering the mundane details of our respective lives that we'd missed in the months since our last gathering. Jackson described his ongoing divorce proceedings with surprising detachment. Will shared anecdotes from his surgical residency. Bennett remained characteristically reserved about his government cybersecurity work, though he did mention an upcoming international assignment. I contributed little, finding myself increasingly distracted by our surroundings. As night solidified around us, the wilderness seemed to compress, drawing closer. The vastness that had been so evident during daylight hours somehow constricted in the darkness, as though the mountains were slowly bending toward us. "Earth to daydreamer," Will snapped his fingers near my face. "You planning to actually eat that food you've been stirring for the last 5 minutes?" I forced a laugh, attributing my distraction to altitude fatigue. But as we eventually retreated to our tents, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, not by anything human, but by the landscape itself, ancient and indifferent to our presence. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds that echoed across the lake. The crack of distant branches, the hollow call of night birds, and occasionally, something that resembled footsteps circling our campsite, though none of us would acknowledge this last observation until much later. Dawn arrived with merciful brightness, dispelling the unsettling impressions of the night. We emerged from our tents to find the lake shrouded in a thin layer of mist that would burn away within the hour. After a breakfast of instant coffee and protein bars, we decided to attempt one of the nearby peaks, a nameless summit that rose approximately 10,500 feet above sea level. "Proper acclimation would mean waiting another day," Bennett reminded us, always the voice of caution. "Since when have we done anything properly?" Jackson countered, already repacking his day pack with water and emergency supplies. We left our campsite intact, marking our location on GPS before beginning the ascent. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as we climbed, transitioning from forest to alpine meadow to exposed rock face. Conversation waned as we conserved energy, the thinning air demanding greater effort for even basic exertion. By midday, we'd reached what appeared to be the summit, a relatively flat plateau offering panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. The vastness was humbling. From this elevation, we could see the curvature of the earth, mountains rolling toward the horizon like frozen waves. "Worth the oxygen deprivation," Will gasped, dropping onto a sun-warmed boulder. We scattered across the plateau, each finding our own space to absorb the magnitude of the landscape. I'd wandered perhaps 50 yards from the others when I heard Bennett call out, "Guys, come look at this." Something in his tone, a strain of uncertainty I'd rarely heard from him, immediately set me on edge. I jogged toward his voice, joining Jackson and Will as they converged on Bennett's position near the eastern edge of the plateau. He stood motionless, staring downward. Following his gaze, I saw it, a horse skull, bleached bone white by sun and weather, resting amidst a scatter of loose stones. "Trail riders don't come this high," Jackson said, voicing what we were all thinking. Bennett crouched beside the skull, careful not to touch it. No other bones. Just the head. The skull's empty eye sockets seemed to watch us as we circled it, maintaining an instinctive distance. The bone was completely clean. No tissue remained, no scent of decay. Nature's cleaning process is thorough but slow. This skull had been exposed to the elements for months, possibly years. "Maybe a mountain lion dragged it up here," Will suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Jackson shook his head. "Predators don't typically separate skulls so cleanly from the rest of the skeleton, and they certainly don't carry heavy bones to higher elevations." I removed my phone, snapping several photos of the skull from different angles. "Bizarre souvenir of the trip," I said, attempting to lighten the mood, though the hollow feeling in my stomach suggested I'd failed even to convince myself. "Someone brought it here," Bennett concluded, his expression unreadable. "Deliberately." The implication hung between us, that we might not be as alone in this supposedly remote wilderness as we'd believed. The vast openness of the plateau suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. "Let's head back down," I suggested, and no one argued. As we descended, I found myself repeatedly glancing over my shoulder, scanning the landscape for movement. The majesty of the mountain had somehow transformed in the hour since our discovery. What had seemed awe-inspiring now felt vaguely threatening. as though the wilderness itself had revealed an aspect we hadn't previously perceived. We returned to camp in near silence, each absorbed in private thoughts. The lake that had seemed so inviting the previous evening now appeared opaque, concealing unknown depths. The surrounding forest, which had provided comfortable shelter, now suggested countless hiding places. "You're all being ridiculous," Will finally declared as we slumped around our unlit cook stove. "It's just a skull. Probably been there for years." "Probably," Bennett agreed, though without conviction. But the discovery had altered something fundamental in our perception, introducing an element of human interference where we'd expected only natural processes. Someone had brought that skull to the summit. Someone strong enough to carry it up the same punishing terrain we just navigated, and with motivation we couldn't begin to comprehend. That evening, we found ourselves huddling closer together than usual, our conversation subdued and frequently interrupted by extended silences during which we all seemed to be listening intently to the surrounding wilderness. By the following morning, the unease spawned by our discovery had partially subsided, replaced by the more immediate discomforts of wilderness living, specifically the layer of dried sweat and grime that coated our skin after 2 days without washing. "I can smell each of you individually," Will complained over another breakfast of instant coffee and protein bars. "I'm distinguishing unique bouquets at this point." "Like you're any better," Jackson retorted, throwing a pine cone that bounced harmlessly off Will's shoulder. The lake beckoned with its clear, cold water. Despite the residual discomfort from yesterday's discovery, the prospect of washing away days of accumulated filth proved irresistible. "We should spread out along the shore," Bennett suggested, practical as always. "Give each other some privacy." We gathered our biodegradable soap and clean clothing, then dispersed along the lake shore. The shoreline's irregular shape, punctuated by small ridges and clusters of trees, provided natural partitions. I selected a spot approximately 200 yards from our campsite, where a gentle slope of smooth stones provided easy access to deeper water. The air temperature hovered in the mid-70s, warm by mountain standards, but the lake water retained the numbing cold of snowmelt. I removed my boots and socks first, allowing my feet to acclimate to the temperature before committing to full immersion. The water clarity was remarkable. I could see every detail of the lake bed, watching small fish dart between submerged rocks. I'd removed my shirt and was unfastening my belt when I heard it. Jackson's voice, distant but clear, calling for us to come quickly. Something in his tone triggered an immediate response. I abandoned my washing plans, hastily grabbing my shirt and boots without putting them on. The lakeshore was uneven, forcing me to pick my path carefully over slippery rocks and through dense undergrowth. I followed the sound of voices, eventually climbing a small ridge that separated my chosen washing spot from what appeared to be a secluded cove. As I crested the ridge, I saw them, Jackson, Will, and Bennett, standing in a loose semicircle facing away from me. They were unnaturally still, like figures in a tableau. Will wore only his hiking shorts, his bare torso pale against the darker background of pine trees. Bennett was fully dressed, but missing one boot. Jackson stood slightly apart, his hand raised to his mouth in what appeared to be a gesture of shock or revulsion. I called out as I approached, but none of them responded or turned. It wasn't until I drew alongside them that I understood their stillness, understood what had transfixed them so completely. Before us, partially submerged in the shallow water of the cove, lay the carcass of a horse. The animal was massive, a draft horse perhaps, with a coat that might once have been chestnut but was now mottled with decay and water damage. Its legs extended rigidly, and its bloated body had been dragged partially onto the shore, revealing the horror that had silenced my friends. The horse had no head. The separation wasn't ragged or torn. There was a precision to it that suggested deliberate removal rather than predator activity. The neck ended in a clean line just below where the skull would have connected. "Jesus," Will whispered, then immediately corrected himself. "God Almighty." None of us moved closer. The carcass showed signs of having been in the water for some time, perhaps a week or more based on the state of decomposition, but not long enough to account for the completely clean, dry skull we'd found on the mountain peak. Could be a coincidence, Bennett said without conviction. Different horses. Jackson shook his head slowly. What are the odds of finding two separate dead horses in the same remote area? One missing its head, the other just a skull. Will took an unsteady step backward. This isn't right. We need to report this to rangers. We're 18 miles from the nearest marked trail, I reminded him. At least a full day's hike to reach a ranger station. A heavy silence descended as we absorbed the implications of our situation, isolated in remote backcountry with evidence of something disturbing and inexplicable. Bennett was the first to recover his composure. We should document this before deciding our next move. The suggestion was rational, appealing to our need for concrete action in the face of something we couldn't immediately comprehend. Jackson retrieved his phone from his pocket, moving closer to take photographs of the headless carcass from multiple angles. I found myself scanning our surroundings, suddenly hyper-aware of the dense forest that pressed close to the lakeshore. The wilderness that had seemed so pristine, so empty of human interference, now felt watchful, as though we had stumbled into someone's private domain, a place where rules and understandings different from our own prevailed. Will voiced what we were all thinking. Someone did this. Recently. And with that simple statement, the wilderness transformed around us. No longer a neutral landscape of rock and water and living things, it became a potential hiding place for someone, or something, capable of deliberate cruelty on a scale none of us had encountered before. While Jackson documented the headless horse with his camera phone, Will paced restlessly along the shoreline. Whether from nervous energy or a need to establish a perimeter, I couldn't be sure. Bennett crouched near the water's edge, examining the ground with the methodical attention he brought to everything. Tracks here, he announced, gesturing toward a section of muddy shoreline. Human boots, fairly recent, size 11 or 12. We gathered around the impressions. Distinct treads pressed into the soft earth, partially filled with water, but still clearly defined. The implication was unavoidable. Someone had been here, likely within the past day or two, given the clarity of the prints despite recent rainfall. Could be another hiker, I suggested without conviction, who happened upon a headless horse carcass and decided not to report it. Jackson countered. Will had continued his shoreline inspection, moving several yards away toward a cluster of partially submerged rocks. Guys, he called, his voice tight with tension. There's something else. We joined him, following his gaze to what initially appeared to be debris caught among the rocks, thin brown strips that rippled gently in the water's movement. But as Bennett leaned closer, his breath caught audibly. That's film, he said, reaching carefully to extract one of the strips from the water. Photographic negatives. The realization struck us simultaneously. Not digital photography from a modern device, but analog film, deliberately developed and then discarded or lost at this remote location. Bennett held the strip up to the sunlight, and we gathered close, momentarily forgetting the headless carcass behind us. The negatives revealed a series of images in reverse exposure. White where there should be black, dark where there should be light. But even with this inversion, the subject was unmistakable. It's the horse, Jackson whispered, before decomposition set in. The negative showed the same animal we'd discovered, positioned similarly along the shoreline but in a significantly fresher state. And like our discovery, the horse in the photograph was headless, the neck ending in the same clean, deliberate line. Will scrambled to gather more film strips from among the rocks, his earlier caution forgotten in the rush to piece together this macabre puzzle. Each strip contained similar images, the headless horse photographed from various angles, with meticulous attention to detail. These weren't taken for documentation, Bennett observed, his voice clinical but with an underlying tremor. This is aesthetic, composed. He was right. The photographs weren't hasty snapshots but carefully framed images, the work of someone who had arranged their subject, considered lighting and composition, and captured the scene with artistic intent. Who carries analog film equipment into the backcountry? I asked, though the question was largely rhetorical. In an age of digital convenience, the deliberate choice of film seemed significant, anachronistic and somehow more disturbing for its methodical requirements. Film photography demanded patience. Development required chemicals, darkness, precise timing. Whoever had created these images had either transported developed negatives back into the wilderness, or, more unsettlingly, had the means to develop film here in the backcountry. The negatives haven't been here long, Bennett noted, examining the condition of the film. No significant water damage or decomposition of the emulsion, days at most, not weeks. Jackson, who had moved slightly away from our group, suddenly dropped into a crouch, pointing toward a section of pebbled beach. Look at this. The film wasn't washed up, it was weighted down. We joined him, observing how several larger stones had been deliberately placed atop film strips, presumably to prevent them from washing away. This wasn't accidental debris, but intentional placement. Recent enough that whoever left these might still be in the area. Will verbalized our collective thought, his gaze sweeping the surrounding forest with new wariness. The implications assembled themselves with terrible clarity. Someone had killed a horse, removed its head with surgical precision, photographed the result using anachronistic technology, developed the images, and then returned to the scene days later to place the negatives near the decaying carcass. All in wilderness so remote we'd believed ourselves utterly alone. Bennett carefully collected the film strips, placing them in a waterproof pocket of his hiking pants. None of us questioned his actions. Documentation seemed essential, though for what purpose? Evidence, protection, understanding, remained unclear. As we stepped back from the water's edge, the forest around us seemed to contract, the spaces between trees suddenly pregnant with potential concealment. The vastness that had earlier provided a sense of freedom now emphasized our isolation, miles from assistance, surrounded by countless hiding places, in territory familiar to someone who clearly operated by logic we couldn't comprehend. "We need to leave," Will stated flatly. "Now." No one disagreed. Returning to camp took on the quality of a tactical operation. Though we'd seen no direct evidence of human presence beyond the boot prints and film negatives, our awareness had fundamentally shifted. The wilderness was no longer empty. It contained someone whose actions suggested a disturbing detachment from normal behavioral constraints. "We'll pack efficiently, essential items only," Bennett directed as we reached our tents. "Be ready to move in 15 minutes. No one questioned his authority in this moment. Bennett's military background, usually manifested only in his methodical approach to outdoor preparation, now emerged more fully in his capacity for crisis management. As we packed, I found myself repeatedly scanning our surroundings, flinching at ordinary wilderness sounds, the rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant call of birds. Every shadow between trees suggested potential observation. "What about reporting this?" Jackson asked, stuffing his sleeping bag with uncharacteristic carelessness. "Rangers should know there's someone out here, doing whatever this is." "We'll report it once we're safely out," Bennett replied, not pausing in his efficient packing. "First priority is distance." Will had been unusually quiet since our discovery, his normally animated features drawn into an expression of concentrated focus. "Whoever did this knows the terrain better than we do," he observed. "They've been methodical, planned, not impulsive." The assessment was unsettling precisely because it rang true. The skull placement at high elevation, the precision of the decapitation, the deliberate photography and return to the scene, all suggested calculated actions rather than random violence. "Which means they might have monitored typical approach routes," Bennett agreed. "We should avoid retracing our entry path." This proposition added complications. Our original route had been selected for navigability. Alternative paths would likely involve more challenging terrain. But none of us argued against the strategic logic. Within 20 minutes, we had dismantled our camp, leaving minimal evidence of our presence. Bennett consulted his topographical map, tracing a finger along a potential exit route that would take us southeast, rather than returning west along our entry path. "Steeper descent here," he indicated, "but it connects to a game trail that should eventually join the marked path about 5 miles further south than where we entered. Under different circumstances, We might have debated the merits of various routes, weighing difficulty against efficiency. Now, we simply nodded, shouldering our hastily packed bags without complaint. As we prepared to depart, a final unsettling observation struck me. Our campsite, selected for its relatively flat, comfortable terrain, offered excellent visibility of the surrounding area, yet simultaneously made us easily observable from multiple vantage points in the surrounding heights. We had prioritized comfort over security, never considering that such calculations might be necessary in this remote location. We moved out in tight formation, with Bennett taking point and Jackson covering our rear. The heightened vigilance transformed what would normally have been an enjoyable, if challenging, hike into something that more closely resembled an extraction under potential threat. The terrain proved even more difficult than anticipated. The southeastern approach from the lake involved navigating a steep scree slope where loose rock shifted treacherously underfoot. We descended in silence, broken only by the occasional warning about unstable footing or low-hanging branches. Approximately 2 hours into our retreat, we reached a narrow ravine where the path, little more than a game trail at this point, forced us into single file. Rock walls rose sharply on either side, creating a natural bottleneck. I noticed Bennett's hesitation as we approached. "I don't like this," he muttered, scanning the ridgeline above. "Too constricted." But the alternatives involved significantly longer routes or impossibly steep terrain. After a brief pause to assess, we proceeded through the ravine, moving as quickly as safety allowed. The tension peaked as we navigated this constricted passage. Every falling pebble, every brush of fabric against stone, seemed magnified in the enclosed space. The ravine extended for perhaps a quarter mile before gradually widening, our collective relief almost palpable as the walls receded. We had covered approximately 7 miles from our original campsite when Bennett called our first substantial break. We collapsed onto fallen logs and rocks, gulping water and reassessing our position. According to the map, we had another 11 miles before reaching the marked trail where we might encounter other hikers. We should be able to make at least another 6 miles before nightfall, Bennett calculated, studying the angle of the sun. The prospect of darkness was something none of us had directly addressed. The necessity of spending another night in the backcountry hung between us, unspoken but unavoidable. "If we push hard, could we make it all the way out before dark?" Will asked, voicing our collective preference. Bennett shook his head. "Not safely. The terrain gets more technical ahead, and attempting it in failing light would be risking injury." The logic was sound but unsatisfying. Another night in the wilderness with its newfound potential threats stretched before us like a dark promise. We rested only briefly before continuing our descent, each of us privately calculating the distance between our current position and safety, between exposure and shelter, between isolation and the protective presence of others. As afternoon transitioned toward evening, the forest grew denser, the light filtering through the canopy in increasingly oblique patterns. Shadows lengthened, creating pockets of premature darkness among the trees. Every darkened recess seemed to contain potential observation. "We need to select a defensible position before full darkness," Bennett eventually stated, verbalizing the security concerns we all felt. The term defensible, so out of place in what should have been simply a recreational activity, underscored how profoundly our wilderness experience had transformed in the hours since discovering the headless horse and its photographer's calling card. We established our emergency camp on a small plateau backed against a cliff face, providing security from one direction at least. Bennett directed us to construct a minimal camp. No fire, cold rations only, tents pitched close together rather than spread for privacy. "We'll establish a watch rotation," he decided, using a tone that invited no debate. 2-hour shifts, 2 people per shift, no one alone. The arrangement meant reduced sleep for all of us, but the alternative, unwatched vulnerability throughout the night, was unthinkable after what we'd discovered. As darkness descended completely, sounds that would have been merely atmospheric the previous night now carried potential significance. The crack of branches underfoot could be nocturnal animals or human movement. Wind through pine boughs could mask deliberate approach. Even the calls of night birds seemed to contain patterns that suggested communication rather than natural behavior. Will and I took the first watch, positioning ourselves at opposite edges of our small camp, creating a perimeter of awareness while Bennett and Jackson attempted to rest. "This is insane," Will whispered after nearly 30 minutes of tense silence. "We're letting horse parts and some weird photography hobby drive us into paranoia." The rational assessment did nothing to dispel the visceral unease that had settled into our collective consciousness. Something fundamental had been violated, not just the horse whose mutilation was disturbing enough, but our understanding of wilderness itself. The backcountry was supposed to be challenging but fundamentally comprehensible. What we'd encountered operated outside those understandings. "It's not just the horse," I replied, keeping my voice low. "It's the deliberateness of it all. The staging, the return to place the negatives." Will nodded slowly. "The ritual aspect." That was it precisely, the sense of witnessing evidence of some private ceremony or practice, governed by logic we couldn't access. The horse skull placed at high elevation, the headless body positioned along the shoreline, the carefully composed photographs, the deliberate placement of negatives near the decomposing subject. Each element suggested meaning rather than randomness. Our watch passed without incident, and we woke Bennett and Jackson for the second shift. I crawled into my tent, fully clothed including boots, with my pack positioned for immediate grabbing. Sleep seemed impossible under the circumstances, yet exhaustion eventually overcame hypervigilance. I awakened to Bennett's hand on my shoulder, his voice tight with urgency. "Stay absolutely quiet. Listen." Instantly alert, I strained to identify what had prompted his warning. At first, I heard only the ambient sounds of the wilderness at night, then distinguished it. Rhythmic movement through underbrush, approximately 50 yards from our position. Not the random patterns of wildlife, but the deliberate progression of something large, moving with purpose. "Jackson spotted a light," Bennett whispered close to my ear. "Brief flash, like someone using a red-filtered headlamp, coming from the ridge above." We remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe as the sounds continued, measured footsteps moving parallel to our position, neither approaching nor retreating, but maintaining a consistent distance. Occasionally, branches would crack underfoot, followed by prolonged silence as though the source had paused to listen or observe. This continued for approximately 20 minutes, the presence neither revealing itself fully nor departing, but establishing what felt intentionally like awareness of our location without direct confrontation. Eventually, the sounds receded, moving gradually eastward until they faded entirely. We remained frozen in position for what seemed an eternity, none of us willing to break the silence that might reveal our exact location. "Could have been an animal," Will finally suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Bennett shook his head slightly. "Red light filter. Someone's out there." The remainder of the night passed in hyper-vigilant rotation, our watch shifts reduced to 1 hour to combat fatigue. None of us achieved meaningful rest. By the time first light filtered through the trees, we were already packed and prepared to move, eager to escape the oppressive sense of being monitored from just beyond our perceptual boundaries. Our descent resumed with renewed urgency. The physical discomforts of rapid hiking through challenging terrain, blisters, muscle fatigue, minor scrapes from branches, registered as inconsequential compared to the psychological burden of potential observation. We encountered the first sign of regular human presence, a clearly maintained trail marker, shortly after noon. The simple wooden sign, weathered but official, prompted an almost embarrassing surge of relief. We had reached the edge of true isolation, entering terrain where others reliably passed. 8 more miles to the trailhead, Bennett calculated, consulting his map. We covered that distance with a steady determination born of collective urgency, encountering a handful of day hikers moving in the opposite direction. Their casual greetings and ordinary equipment, water bottles rather than filtration systems, light day packs instead of expedition gear, emphasized our transition back toward normal human patterns. We reached Bennett's SUV by late afternoon, collapsing against it with the exhausted relief of soldiers returning from combat. The ordinary objects in the vehicle, spare clothing, forgotten snack wrappers, a forgotten paperback on the back seat, seemed artifacts from a different reality, one governed by comprehensible patterns and predictable causality. "Ranger station?" Jackson suggested as we loaded our gear. Bennett nodded, starting the engine. "We report this, all of it." The ranger's expression shifted from professional courtesy to focused concern as our account progressed. Initially, she seemed to categorize us as typical hikers reporting ordinary wildlife observations. But as Bennett methodically described our discoveries, the horse skull at elevation, the headless carcass by the lake, the carefully placed photographic negatives, her demeanor transformed. "You have the negatives?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Bennett produced the sealed plastic bag containing the film strips we'd collected. The ranger accepted it without touching the contents directly, instead placing it inside an evidence envelope. "And approximate GPS coordinates for both locations?" We provided the data from our devices, watching as she marked positions on a large topographical map of the park's backcountry. I noticed her adding our discovery to other markers already present on the map, small red pins clustered in several remote areas. "We're not the first to report something like this, are we?" Will observed. The ranger's hesitation was brief but telling. "We've had reports of unusual findings in the backcountry, nothing conclusively connected." "But similar enough that you're tracking them," Bennett pressed. She studied us for a moment, apparently assessing how much information to share with civilians. "There have been several reports over the past 3 years of animal remains positioned in what appear to be deliberate arrangements, primarily in very remote areas, primarily discovered by experienced backcountry users like yourselves." "And the photography aspect?" I asked. Another hesitation. "You're the third group to report finding photographic documentation near displays. First with negatives, though. Previous reports involved Polaroid photographs." The information sent a chill through me despite the ranger station's comfortable warmth. Not isolated incidents, then, but a pattern, evolving but consistent in its fundamental aspects. "Do you have any suspects?" Jackson asked. The ranger closed her notebook with deliberate care. "I can't discuss ongoing investigations, but I can tell you we're taking this very seriously. Your report is valuable, particularly the detail about movement near your camp during the night." We provided contact information and formal statements, a process that occupied several hours. By the time we departed the ranger station, darkness had fallen again, though this time punctuated by the reassuring artificial lights of civilization. That should have been the conclusion, a disturbing wilderness encounter, properly reported to authorities, relegated to anecdote status. But 7 years later, I find the experience has not receded, but rather has periodically resurfaced with unexpected clarity. I still hike, though never again in Yellowstone's backcountry. My annual trips with Jackson, Will, and Bennett continued for several years afterward, though with subtle adjustments. Preferences for popular, well-traveled routes, avoidance of truly remote locations, a collective unspoken gravitation toward trails where regular ranger patrols were known to operate. Eventually, our group expeditions tapered as life intervened. Bennett accepted an overseas assignment. Will's surgical practice demanded increasing time. Jackson relocated to the Pacific Northwest after finalizing his divorce. We maintain contact through sporadic video calls and occasional one-on-one visits, but our collective wilderness adventures have become archival rather than ongoing. I followed news reports about Yellowstone for years afterward, searching for any mention of unusual discoveries or arrests related to what we'd encountered. Nothing conclusive ever emerged publicly. Occasional vague references to vandalism or wildlife harassment in extremely remote areas suggested continued activity, but details remained sparse. 3 years after our experience, I received an unexpected email from the ranger who had taken our report. She offered no specifics, but did mention that our information had contributed significantly to an ongoing federal investigation. She thanked us for our detailed observations and advised that we might be contacted by federal authorities, though such contact never materialized. Sometimes during otherwise ordinary moments, standing in line at a grocery store, sitting in traffic, attending a workplace meeting, I am suddenly overtaken by the memory of those negatives held up against mountain sunlight, revealing their inverted images of deliberate mutilation. Or I recall the measured footsteps circling our camp in darkness, the brief flash of filtered red light among distant trees. In these moments, I'm reminded that wilderness represents more than geographical remoteness. It can also describe psychological territory, spaces beyond normal constraints, where actions that would be immediately identified and contained in civilization can unfold according to private logic, visible only through their careful documentation. I've come to believe that what we encountered was neither supernatural nor particularly mysterious in itself. Rather, we glimpsed evidence of human behavior operating beyond social boundaries, in terrain where oversight is minimal and private ritual can develop uninterrupted. The wilderness amplified this encounter not through any inherent quality, but through the stark contrast it provided: beauty against cruelty, vastness against intimate detail, natural processes against deliberate interference. The national parks brochures warn visitors about bears, unpredictable weather, and treacherous terrain. They suggest proper equipment, adequate water, and appropriate emergency preparations. They never mention the possibility of encountering evidence that the human capacity for disturbing behavior extends even into supposedly pristine wilderness. That someone might be watching from beyond the firelight, documenting their private ceremonies, and occasionally allowing others glimpses of practices governed by impenetrable personal mythology. Our hiking group's unspoken motto had always been that the scariest thing in the wilderness was the occasional uncomfortable outdoor bathroom situation. We were wrong. The truly frightening element was what we brought with us: human consciousness with its capacity for both transcendent appreciation and unfathomable cruelty, existing simultaneously in the same magnificent landscape. By 2018, my friend Jake and I had been hiking companions for nearly a decade. We had traversed the dense forests of Washington and Oregon together, endured the scorching heat of southwestern deserts, and conquered the challenging peaks of the Sierra Nevada side by side. Our experiences had forged a deep trust between us, the kind that develops only through shared hardships and triumphs in remote wilderness areas. After years of exploring familiar territories, we craved something more demanding, more isolated, more primal. That's when Jake suggested the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, or simply the Frank, as seasoned outdoorsmen call it. Located in Idaho and spanning over 2 million acres, it represents one of the largest contiguous wilderness areas in the continental United States. The name itself carried an ominous weight that should have been our first warning. "It's the real deal," Jake said one evening as we studied maps in my apartment. "No cell service, minimal ranger patrols, and terrain so rough that most tourists never go beyond the first few miles of marked trails." His eyes gleamed with anticipation as his finger traced potential routes across the topographic lines. We'd have the place practically to ourselves. I studied the map, noting the vast distances between access points, the dramatic elevation changes, and the numerous river crossings. "It looks intense," I admitted, "much more isolated than anything we've done before." "That's precisely the point," Jake responded, leaning back in his chair with a smile that revealed both confidence and challenge. "Are you getting hesitant? Because I can always ask someone else." That subtle provocation was all it took. 3 weeks later, we were methodically packing our gear for what would become the most harrowing experience of my life. The evening before our departure, I stood in my living room surrounded by equipment: ultralight tent, sub-zero sleeping bag, water filtration system, first aid supplies, topographic maps, compass, GPS unit, dried foods, cooking equipment, and clothing for all weather conditions. Everything had been meticulously selected, balancing weight against necessity. I recalled the warnings I'd read online about the Frank, stories of experienced hikers who had disappeared, accounts of sudden weather changes that trapped people for days, and tales of encounters with wildlife that ended badly. Warnings that I had dismissed as exaggerations designed to keep novices away. That night, I barely slept. An inexplicable unease had settled in my chest, Not the usual pre-adventure excitement, but something darker, more foreboding. In retrospect, perhaps it was intuition trying to warn me, but I ignored it, attributing the sensation to normal pre-trip anxiety. Dawn brought clarity and determination. We loaded my Subaru Outback, secured the roof rack, and began the long journey northward from California into Idaho's rugged interior. The drive took nearly 2 days, the landscape gradually transforming from the familiar to the foreign. Civilization thinned out as we progressed, small towns giving way to isolated gas stations, then to nothing but wilderness. By late afternoon of the second day, we arrived at a small graveled trailhead near the middle fork of the Salmon River. A weathered wooden sign displayed a crude map of the area, along with faded warnings about bear activity and current fire restrictions. The parking area was empty except for a single dusty pickup truck at the far end. "Looks like we have the place to ourselves," Jake observed, stretching after the long drive. His voice carried an edge of satisfaction that I initially mistook for simple enthusiasm. We unloaded our packs, performed final equipment checks, and locked the car. I remember hesitating, looking back at the vehicle, our last connection to the world we were leaving behind. For a moment, I considered suggesting we postpone, start smaller, perhaps try a less remote section. But pride silenced my concerns. As we shouldered our packs and took our first steps onto the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced toward the pickup truck, but saw no one. The only witnesses to our departure were the ancient pines that towered above, their branches swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. "Ready for the best hike of your life?" Jake asked, already several paces ahead. I forced a smile. Born ready. Neither of us could have anticipated what the Frank had in store for us. The first day progressed without incident. We maintained a steady pace along a well-marked trail that wound through dense pine forest. The air was crisp and fragrant with the scent of evergreens and earth. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. We covered approximately 8 miles before making camp near a clear, gurgling creek. The routine was familiar. Jake set up the tent while I filtered water and prepared a simple meal of dehydrated chili. We ate in comfortable silence, occasionally commenting on the day's hike or pointing out wildlife. That first night in the wilderness was peaceful, almost deceptively so. The stars blazed overhead in numbers I'd forgotten existed, their light undimmed by urban pollution. I fell asleep to the gentle sounds of water flowing over stone and wind whispering through pine needles. The second day brought more challenging terrain. The trail narrowed and began to climb, switchbacking up ridges and descending into valleys. The underbrush thickened, sometimes encroaching on the path until we had to push through tangled vegetation. Conversation dwindled as we focused on negotiating the increasingly difficult landscape. By late afternoon, we had penetrated deeper into the wilderness than either of us had anticipated. The marked trail had become less distinct, occasionally disappearing entirely before reappearing several yards ahead. At times, we relied on cairns, small stacks of rocks placed by previous hikers, to guide our way. "We're making good time," Jake remarked during a brief water break. He studied our position on the map, tracing our progress with his finger. "Another day like this and we'll reach the canyon overlook. The views there are supposed to be incredible." I nodded, conserving energy. My legs ached from the day's exertion, but it was a satisfying discomfort, the kind that comes from pushing physical limits in pursuit of something worthwhile. That evening, we pitched our tent on a relatively flat area protected by a stand of ancient cedar trees. The location offered a partial view of the valley below, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. We boiled water for our freeze-dried meals, the steam rising in the cooling air. Jake seemed unusually quiet during dinner, his gaze repeatedly drawn to the deeper wilderness that extended beyond our campsite. When I asked what was on his mind, he simply shrugged and said, "Just thinking about tomorrow's route." But there was something in his expression, a tension around his eyes, a slight furrow between his brows, that suggested more was at work than simple route planning. I slept fitfully that night, awakening several times to unfamiliar sounds. The distant howl of a wolf, the sudden snap of a branch, and once, what sounded like voices carried on the wind, though I dismiss this as the product of dreams blending with reality. The third day dawned gray and cool, with low clouds obscuring the mountain peaks. We ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, packed up our gear, and resumed our journey. The trail had become increasingly difficult to follow, sometimes disappearing completely beneath fallen trees or washed-out sections. Around midday, Jake stopped abruptly and turned to me with an expression that combined excitement with something else, something almost predatory. "I'm thinking we should go off-trail," he suggested, gesturing toward a densely wooded area to our right. "The real Frank is out there, not on these tourist paths." I hesitated. Going off-trail meant abandoning the security of a marked route, relying instead on our navigation skills and equipment. It meant entering territory where help, if needed, would be significantly harder to find. "Are you sure that's wise?" I asked, scanning the imposing forest. "We're already pretty deep in." Jake's expression hardened slightly. "I thought you wanted an adventure. If you're scared, we can stick to the kiddie trail." His words stung, as they were meant to. We had been friends long enough for him to know exactly how to provoke me. I knew I was being manipulated, but pride overrode caution. "Lead the way," I said, adjusting my pack straps. Jake grinned and immediately veered off the trail, plunging into the thick underbrush. I followed, pushing aside branches and ducking under low-hanging limbs. The change was immediate and disorienting. Without the trail as reference, the forest seemed to close in around us. Trees grew closer together, their trunks wider than my shoulders, their roots creating a chaotic maze across the forest floor. Moss draped everything, muffling sound and dimming the already subdued daylight. The ground underfoot became a spongy carpet that sometimes gave way unexpectedly. Our progress slowed considerably. We had to navigate around fallen trees, deep ravines, and dense thickets. The visibility was poor, rarely extending beyond 50 yards in any direction. More than once, I found myself turned around, temporarily losing sight of Jake and feeling a surge of panic before locating him again. The air grew heavier, filled with the rich scent of decay and growth, the smell of a forest largely untouched by human presence. Birds called from unseen perches, their voices strange and somehow ominous in the filtered light. After perhaps 2 hours of this challenging travel, Jake suddenly stopped, his head tilted slightly as if listening. I paused beside him, my breath coming in controlled gasps from the exertion. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first, I heard nothing beyond our breathing and the ambient sounds of the forest. Then it reached me. A low, steady hum, distinctly mechanical and completely out of place in this wilderness setting. We exchanged glances but said nothing. By unspoken agreement, we moved toward the sound, curiosity overriding caution. The hum grew louder as we pushed forward, eventually resolving into what I recognized as distorted music, heavy and aggressive, with screaming vocals barely discernible beneath layers of electronic distortion. After a few minutes of careful progress, we broke through a thicket of young saplings and found ourselves facing the source of the sound. A concrete bunker, partially sunken into a low rise, its steel door hanging slightly ajar. The concrete exterior was covered in bizarre symbols, circles, zigzags, and lines that formed no recognizable pattern. The music emanated from within, pulsing like a heartbeat of something malevolent. We stopped a few yards from the entrance, suddenly aware of how exposed we were. The bunker seemed profoundly wrong in this setting, a human intrusion of the most jarring kind, not a ranger station or hiker's shelter, but something secretive and threatening. "What the hell is this place?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the throbbing music. Jake shook his head slowly. "No idea. Military, maybe? Or some survivalist compound?" I studied the symbols scratched into the concrete. They appeared crude but intentional, possibly ritual in nature. The music continued to pulse from within the partially open door, heavy and violent. "Should we check it out?" Jake asked, his voice carrying an undercurrent of excitement that alarmed me. Are you insane? I hissed. We have no idea who's in there or what they're doing. The sensible course of action was obvious. Retreat quietly and continue our journey, perhaps reporting the location to rangers once we returned to civilization. But as we stood there, I realized a disturbing truth. Part of me wanted to look inside, to solve the mystery of this anomalous structure in the middle of nowhere. Before we could decide, fate intervened. A sudden gust of wind carried the scent of cigarette smoke to us. Someone was outside the bunker, possibly watching us right now. I caught Jake's eye and tilted my head back in the direction we had come. He nodded, understanding immediately. We turned and began to retreat, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. We had covered perhaps a few hundred yards when the forest around us changed. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint immediately. Not a sound or a sight, but a feeling, as if the air itself had become charged with hostile intent. "We're being followed," Jake whispered, voicing what I already suspected. We quickened our pace, no longer concerned with stealth but with putting distance between ourselves and the bunker. Branches scraped against my arms and face as I pushed through the dense vegetation. We were discussing who would build such a structure in this remote location when two figures materialized from the trees ahead, as if they had been waiting for us. They wore full camouflage gear with balaclavas concealing their faces. Each held what appeared to be an AK-style rifle, barrels currently pointed downward but gripped with obvious readiness. My entire body tensed as Jake and I stopped, frozen in place. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. The only sound was our labored breathing and the distant thump of music from the bunker behind us. Then one of the men raised his rifle, pointing it directly at us. "On your knees," he commanded, his voice flat and emotionless. "Arms up." I glanced at Jake, whose hands were moving toward the straps of his backpack. In that moment, I realized we were in genuine danger. These weren't park rangers or even ordinary hunters. The remoteness of our location, the hidden bunker, the concealed faces. Everything pointed to people who operated outside the law. As I slowly raised my hands, Jake made his move. In one fluid motion, he unclipped his pack, let it drop to the ground, and bolted to the right, disappearing into the trees. The sudden action broke my paralysis. I released my own pack straps and ran after him, zigzagging between tree trunks. A shot cracked through the air, deafeningly loud in the confined space of the forest. Bark exploded from a tree to my left, showering me with splinters. I ducked instinctively but kept running, my lungs burning and heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, I heard someone shouting, "Cease fire! We need them alive!" The words sent a wave of terror through me, more potent than the gunfire. Whatever these men wanted us for, it wasn't something I was willing to discover. More shots followed, lower now, kicking up dirt around my feet. They were aiming to wound, to slow us down, to capture rather than kill. This realization propelled me forward with renewed desperation. Jake was ahead of me, weaving through the trees with the agility of someone whose life depended on it, which it did. I matched his pace, grateful for the years of hiking that had conditioned my body for this kind of sustained exertion. The gunfire eventually stopped, but we continued running until our legs threatened to give out. When we finally stopped, both of us were gasping for breath, bodies trembling from adrenaline and exertion. "I think we lost them," Jake managed between gulps of air, leaning against a tree for support. We listened intently, hearing nothing but the natural sounds of the forest and our own ragged breathing. No footsteps, no voices, no gunfire. But the absence of pursuit offered little comfort given our new reality. We were now deep in wilderness territory without our packs, which meant no food, no shelter, no maps, and no emergency equipment. As the initial surge of adrenaline faded, the gravity of our situation began to sink in. We were truly alone, truly vulnerable, and night was approaching. The first night without our equipment was an exercise in misery. As darkness enveloped the forest, the temperature dropped rapidly. Without sleeping bags or tent, we were at the mercy of the elements. We huddled against a fallen log, pulling our jackets tightly around us in a futile attempt to conserve body heat. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but thirst was the more immediate concern. We had found a small stream before nightfall and drunk our fill, but without containers to carry water, we would need to locate new sources regularly. Sleep came in brief, troubled intervals. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the cracking of branches under the weight of nocturnal creatures, jolted me awake, convinced that our pursuers had found us. In the darkness, my imagination populated the shadows with armed men creeping closer, their rifles aimed at our sleeping forms. Jake seemed equally vigilant. We spoke little, each lost in private calculations of survival and escape. Dawn brought a bone-deep chill and renewed awareness of our hunger. We found a bush with small berries that Jake identified as safe to eat. They were sour and barely ripe, staining our fingers purple as we picked them, but they provided minimal sustenance. "We need to keep moving south," Jake said, studying the position of the morning sun through gaps in the canopy. "That's our best chance of reaching the trailhead." I nodded, too exhausted for conversation. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and my mouth felt dry despite having drunk water recently. The first signs of dehydration I recognized, not severe yet, but concerning nonetheless. We walked all day, stopping only to drink from streams and forage what edible plants we could find. The forest stretched endlessly around us, trees so numerous and similar that progress felt illusory. Were we actually moving toward safety, or merely wandering in circles? Without maps or GPS, certainty was impossible. By evening, blisters had formed on my feet, each step becoming increasingly painful. Jake wasn't faring much better. I noticed him wincing whenever he put weight on his right ankle. We found shelter under an overhanging rock formation, not ideal, but better than complete exposure. The night was clear, allowing the temperature to drop even lower than the previous evening. We couldn't risk a fire that might attract our pursuers, so we endured the cold, shivering violently as darkness settled around us. "Who do you think they were?" I asked, breaking the long silence. Jake stared into the darkness. "Militia, maybe. Or drug operations. This area is perfect for anyone wanting to stay off the grid." "What would they have done if they'd caught us?" He turned to me, his expression grim in the faint moonlight. "Let's be grateful we didn't find out." I fell into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of men in masks dragging us back to their bunker, down into darkness where the pounding music never stopped. I awoke multiple times, heart racing, convinced I'd heard footsteps approaching. The third day brought weakness and disorientation. My vision occasionally blurred at the edges, and standing too quickly caused dizziness. We found more berries and some edible roots, but our bodies were operating at a severe caloric deficit. "We need protein," Jake muttered, scanning the forest floor for signs of small game. "And fat. We can't keep going like this." But we had no weapons, no traps, no means of hunting. We trudged onward, each step requiring conscious effort. Conversation dwindled to essential communication only. Warnings about difficult terrain ahead, notifications of water sources, brief consultations about direction. The forest had transformed from a place of adventure to one of menace. Every shadow concealed potential threats. Every unexpected sound triggered a surge of adrenaline. The wild, which had once been our playground, had become our prison. Late in the afternoon, Jake suddenly stopped, raising his hand for silence. I froze, straining to hear what had caught his attention. "Engine," he whispered, pointing to our right. At first I heard nothing. Then it reached me. The distant but unmistakable sound of a motor vehicle. It could mean salvation or danger. There was no way to know which. We moved cautiously toward the sound, pushing through dense underbrush until we emerged onto a narrow dirt road, little more than a rutted track cutting through the trees, but unmistakably man-made. "Civilization," I breathed, feeling a surge of hope for the first time in days. Jake nodded, but his expression remained cautious. Could be anyone's road. Might lead to a ranger station, might lead back to them. We debated briefly before deciding to follow the road. Even if it didn't lead directly to safety, It would eventually connect to larger roads and, ultimately, to people who could help us. We walked for perhaps an hour, staying just inside the tree line rather than on the exposed road itself, a compromise between making good time and maintaining caution. The road curved and dipped, following the natural contours of the land. As we rounded a bend, a small wooden structure came into view. A ranger station, its windows glowing with warm light in the fading day. A pickup truck with National Park Service markings was parked outside. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that my knees nearly buckled. Jake placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, his own expression revealing the same profound emotion. "We made it," he said simply. We approached the ranger station slowly, aware of our appearance. Filthy, scratched, clothes torn, faces gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. The ranger who opened the door took one look at us and immediately ushered us inside. "Good Lord, what happened to you boys?" he asked, already moving to pour coffee and retrieve first aid supplies. He was an older man with a gray beard and weathered face, his uniform bearing the faded patch of someone who had served in the wilderness for decades. His name tag identified him as Ranger Wilson. As we sipped hot coffee with trembling hands, we recounted our experience. The bunker, the strange symbols, the armed men who had pursued us, our desperate flight through the forest without supplies. Wilson listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When we finished, he picked up his radio and contacted local police, providing our location and a brief summary of our story. Then he turned back to us. "You're lucky to be alive," he said simply. "That area has a history of problems." "What kind of problems?" Jake asked. Wilson sighed, seeming to weigh how much to tell us. "The Frank is big, too big to patrol effectively. Over the years, it's attracted people who want to disappear. Some are just off-grid types, harmless enough. Others are more dangerous. Militia groups, survivalists with extreme views, even criminal operations." "And the authorities just let them stay out there?" I asked, incredulous. "It's complicated," Wilson replied. "Limited resources, jurisdictional issues. Sometimes we know generally where these groups are operating, but without specific evidence of criminal activity, there's not much that can be done. And when there is evidence, mounting an operation in terrain like this is extremely difficult and dangerous." 2 police officers arrived about an hour later. They took our statements, their expressions professional but skeptical, in a way that suggested they'd heard similar stories before. They promised to send rangers to investigate the bunker location, based on our best attempt to describe its position. We spent the night at the ranger station, sleeping on cots that felt luxurious after our nights on the forest floor. In the morning, the police returned with news. The rangers had found the bunker, but it was empty. No people, no equipment, just the concrete structure with its bizarre symbols scratched into the walls. Our backpacks were nowhere to be found. "These groups are mobile," one officer explained. "They probably cleared out as soon as they realized there were witnesses in the area. They'll likely relocate to another section of the wilderness." The implication was clear. They were still out there, just somewhere else now. The thought sent a chill through me despite the warmth of the ranger station. After providing us with meals and basic medical attention for our various minor injuries, Ranger Wilson drove us back to our car at the trailhead. It sat exactly as we had left it, a surreal reminder of how dramatically our circumstances had changed in just a few days. The drive home was largely silent. Jake stared out the passenger window, his expression unreadable. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, replaying events in my mind, questioning decisions, wondering about alternative outcomes. The wilderness that had once been a source of joy and escape had revealed a darker aspect, a reminder that not all dangers in the wild come from nature itself. The physical recovery came quickly. Within a week, the blisters had healed, the scratches had faded, and the persistent ache of hunger had become a distant memory. The psychological aftermath proved more enduring. I found myself startling at unexpected sounds, even in the safety of my apartment. Sleep became elusive, disrupted by dreams of pursuit through endless forests or of masked men dragging me into darkened bunkers. During waking hours, I was hyper-vigilant, constantly scanning for threats that weren't there. Jake and I spoke infrequently in the weeks following our return. When we did talk, our conversations were superficial, deliberately avoiding discussion of what had happened in the Frank. It was as if acknowledging the experience would somehow make it more real, more present in our lives. 1 month after our return, Jake called unexpectedly late one evening. "I've been doing some research," he said without preamble, "about the Frank and the symbols we saw." I felt a tightening in my chest. "Why? It's over. We got lucky. Best to leave it behind us." "Is it, though?" His voice had an intensity that alarmed me. "Don't you want to understand what we stumbled into?" "Not particularly," I replied, though this wasn't entirely true. Despite my attempts to move forward, questions lingered in my mind. Who were those men? What purpose did the bunker serve? What did the symbols mean? But pursuing answers seemed dangerous, a path leading back toward experiences I was trying to forget. "I found something," Jake continued, ignoring my reluctance. "Those symbols, they're used by a group called the Covenant of the Sacred Earth. They're an extreme survivalist cult with apocalyptic beliefs. They think society is on the verge of collapse and are preparing for what they call the Great Cleansing." "How do you know this?" I asked, unsettled by both the information and Jake's apparent obsession with it. "Internet forums, news archives, academic papers on domestic extremism. It took some digging, but the patterns match. The symbols, the remote location, the armed security, it all fits their profile." I remained silent, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to end the conversation, to hang up and continue pretending that our experience had been an isolated incident, a random encounter with danger that held no larger significance. Another part recognized that understanding might be the only path to true recovery. "There's more," Jake said into my silence. "According to some sources, they're involved in weapons trafficking, possibly even human trafficking. They use the wilderness as a staging ground, a place where they can operate outside of government oversight." "Did you tell the police about this?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "I tried. They took my statement but didn't seem particularly interested. One officer basically patted me on the head and suggested I was connecting dots that weren't there." "Maybe you are," I suggested gently. "We were under extreme stress. Trauma can make people see patterns." "I'm not imagining this," Jake interrupted, his voice sharp. "I know what I saw, what we saw. These people are dangerous and they're operating right under everyone's noses." The conversation ended shortly thereafter, with Jake promising to send me links to his research and me promising, half-heartedly, to review them. After hanging up, I sat in my darkened apartment, a subtle tremor in my hands as memories I'd been suppressing threatened to resurface. I didn't look at Jake's research when it arrived in my email the next day. Instead, I archived the message, telling myself I would examine it when I felt ready, a time I secretly suspected would never come. 2 weeks later, Jake called again. This time, his voice was hushed, almost conspiratorial. "I think I'm being watched," he said without greeting. "What?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "There's been a car parked across from my apartment for 3 days. Different people inside, but always the same car. And I've noticed someone following me when I go out." "Jake, listen to yourself," I urged. "This sounds paranoid. Maybe you should talk to someone, a professional." "I'm not paranoid," he snapped. "They know we saw them. They know we can identify their location. We're loose ends." "The Rangers said the bunker was empty when they checked. They've moved on, Jake. They don't care about us." "That's what they want you to think." His voice had taken on a feverish quality that alarmed me. "I'm going back." "You're what?" I nearly shouted. "I'm going back to the Frank. I need evidence. Concrete proof of what's happening out there. Photos, recordings, something the authorities can't ignore." "That's insane," I said, genuine fear rising within me. "We barely escaped with our lives last time. You can't seriously be considering going back, especially alone." "I'm not asking for your permission," Jake replied coldly. I'm telling you because you were there. You saw what I saw. I thought you might understand. What I understand is that you're not thinking clearly, I insisted. Whatever is out there, it's not worth risking your life over. Some things are bigger than individual safety, he said. If what I suspect is true, people are being hurt, maybe killed. I can't just pretend I don't know that. No amount of reasoning could dissuade him. The conversation ended with Jake promising to contact me when he returned, an assurance that did nothing to alleviate my growing dread. 3 days later, I received a text from Jake. Heading in tomorrow. We'll be out of contact for approximately 1 week. If you don't hear from me by the 17th, contact Detective Rivera at Idaho State Police. I've left a sealed envelope with my research and coordinates with my sister. I immediately called him, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message begging him to reconsider, then tried his sister, only to learn that he had already left Idaho Falls that morning, headed for the same trailhead where our ordeal had begun. The following week was torture. I checked my phone obsessively, slept poorly, and found myself unable to focus on work or normal activities. On the evening of the 17th, with no word from Jake, I faced a decision. Honor his request to contact the police, potentially involving myself in whatever trouble he had courted, or respect his choice and allow him the autonomy to face the consequences of his actions. In the end, conscience overrode caution. I called Detective Rivera and relayed Jake's message. The detective listened patiently, asked for details about our previous experience, and promised to look into the matter. His tone was professional but non-committal, the response of someone who had heard many such reports and found most to be unfounded. 3 days later, I received a call from Idaho State Police. They had found Jake's car at the trailhead, but no sign of Jake himself. A search operation was being organized. I flew to Idaho the next day, driven by guilt and a desperate hope that my presence might somehow aid in the search. I spoke with search and rescue teams, provided detailed descriptions of our previous route, and waited in agony for news. The search lasted 5 days before being scaled back. No trace of Jake was found, no equipment, no clothing, no signs of distress or struggle. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him. Most of the search team believed he had become lost or injured in the vast wilderness, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence. Only Detective Rivera seemed to give any credence to the story of armed men in hidden bunkers, and even his interest seemed professional rather than convinced. People disappear in the wild for mundane reasons far more often than dramatic ones, he told me gently. Exposure, falls, animal encounters, these claim more lives than human malice. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. The alternative, that Jake had been right, that he had been taken by the same people who had pursued us, was too horrific to contemplate. I returned home eventually, leaving contact information with local authorities in case new developments arose. Weeks passed, then months. Jake's family held a memorial service, though his body had not been recovered. I attended, hollow-eyed and distant, unable to share with them the full truth of what might have happened to their son and brother. In private moments, I sometimes revisited the archived email containing Jake's research. Each time my finger hovered over it, trembling slightly before I closed the application without opening the message. Whatever truths it contained, I wasn't ready to face them. A year passed. The police officially classified Jake as a missing person presumed deceased due to wilderness mishap. His case remained open, but inactive. Life continued, as it must. I no longer hiked. The very thought of entering even a local nature preserve triggered anxiety so intense it left me gasping for breath. The wilderness had been transformed in my mind from a place of refuge to one of concealed dangers and lurking malice. Sometimes, in the liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, I imagined Jake alone in the forest, pursued by masked men with rifles, calling my name as darkness closed around him. In these moments, I would startle fully awake, drenched in sweat, reaching for a phone to call for help that would never arrive in time. Other nights, I dreamed of the bunker, its door now fully open, revealing stairs that descended into impenetrable darkness. From that darkness, music thumped relentlessly, accompanied by sounds I couldn't or wouldn't identify. In these dreams, I stood at the threshold, knowing that Jake was somewhere below, waiting for me to find him, to save him. But I never entered. I always woke before taking that step. The rational part of my mind understood that these were manifestations of survivor's guilt, my psyche's attempt to process trauma and loss. But rationality offered little comfort in the dark hours when memories of those 3 days in the Frank returned with visceral intensity. 18 months after Jake's disappearance, I received an unexpected email from a journalist named Rebecca Weaver. She was writing a series of articles on missing persons cases in national wilderness areas and wanted to discuss Jake's story. My initial instinct was to ignore the message. I had already declined numerous interview requests from local news outlets and true crime podcasts. But something in her approach seemed different, more substantive than sensational. After several days of consideration, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near my apartment. Rebecca proved to be serious and well prepared, with a stack of notes and a recorder she asked permission to use. She had already interviewed Jake's family and several members of the search team, she explained, and had reviewed the official reports. "What most interests me about your friend's case," she said after preliminary introductions, "is the discrepancy between the official explanation and certain details that don't quite fit the standard lost hiker narrative." "What details?" I asked cautiously. For one, Jake was an experienced outdoorsman who had successfully navigated challenging wilderness before. For another, he left behind what appears to be extensive research into extremist groups operating in the Frank Church wilderness. And then there's your initial report about armed men in a bunker. A report that was largely dismissed by authorities. I stared at her, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Surprise that she had uncovered Jake's research. Relief that someone was taking the more troubling aspects of his disappearance seriously. And renewed fear at the prospect of revisiting those experiences. "I don't know what Jake told you," I began carefully, "but our encounter in the Frank was—" I hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't make me sound delusional. "Traumatic?" Rebecca suggested gently. "Unexplainable? Potentially criminal?" "All of those," I admitted. "But mainly dismissed. Everyone seemed to think we were exaggerating or confused about what we saw." "I don't think you were," Rebecca said, leaning forward slightly. "In fact, I've found evidence that supports your account." She opened a folder and removed several photographs, placing them carefully on the table between us. They showed various wilderness locations, each containing structures similar to the bunker we had encountered. Partially concealed concrete installations with steel doors. Some displayed the same bizarre symbols we had seen. These were taken at different locations throughout Idaho, Montana, and eastern Washington, Rebecca explained. All on public land, all off the grid, all unauthorized. I stared at the images, feeling a cold weight settle in my stomach. What are they? According to my sources, they're outposts of several related extremist groups, militias, survivalists, apocalyptic cults. They use the wilderness as a base of operations precisely because it's so difficult to monitor and patrol. "And the authorities know about these?" I asked, struggling to process what she was showing me. "Some they know about, others they don't. Resources for wilderness law enforcement are stretched incredibly thin, and many of these structures are temporary, used for a few months, then abandoned when there's any hint of official interest." She pulled out another document, this one appearing to be an internal report from a law enforcement agency, though specific identifying information had been redacted. "According to this source, there's been increased activity in the region over the past 3 years. Weapons stockpiling, paramilitary training, and possibly involvement in human trafficking, specifically the transportation of individuals across remote border sections into Canada." "Human trafficking?" I echoed, remembering what Jake had said during our last conversation. Rebecca nodded grimly. "Primarily labor trafficking, moving people who are then forced to work in illegal operations across the border. But also some cases involving—" She paused, seemingly reluctant to continue. "Involving what?" I pressed. "Ritual abuse," she said quietly. Some of these groups have extreme religious or ideological beliefs that include initiatory violence. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too confined. I loosened my collar, trying to maintain composure as memories of the bunker and the masked men collided with these new revelations. I think Jake may have stumbled onto something significant during his research, Rebecca continued. Something that made him dangerous to these groups. And I think that's why he disappeared. If what you're saying is true, I began, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Then why hasn't there been a serious investigation? Why was his case so quickly classified as just another wilderness accident? Rebecca sighed, gathering the photographs and returning them to her folder. That's what I'm trying to find out. It could be simple jurisdictional confusion or resource limitations, or the inherent difficulty of investigating crimes in such remote areas. Or what? Or there could be more deliberate reasons for the lack of official interest. Her expression was carefully neutral as she said this, but her implication was clear. You're suggesting corruption? Official protection of these groups? The idea seemed fantastical, like something from a conspiracy thriller rather than real life. I'm not suggesting anything specific yet, Rebecca replied. I'm gathering information, following leads, looking for patterns. That's why I wanted to speak with you, to hear directly about what you and Jake experienced, without the filter of official reports. I spent the next 2 hours recounting everything in excruciating detail: the bunker, the symbols, the armed men, our escape, and later, Jake's growing obsession with understanding what we had encountered. Rebecca listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly allowing me to tell the story at my own pace. When I finished, she thanked me and provided her contact information, encouraging me to reach out if I remembered additional details or had concerns about my safety. What exactly are you planning to do with this information? I asked as we prepared to leave. Write the most comprehensive and accurate article I can, she replied. Shine light on something that's been kept in darkness for too long. Isn't that dangerous? If these groups are as violent as you suggest. She smiled slightly, though her eyes remained serious. Journalism always involves some risk when the subject matter is significant. But I take precautions, and the public deserves to know what's happening in our public lands. As we parted ways, Rebecca made one final comment that would haunt me in the weeks to come. Your friend Jake was brave. Foolish, perhaps, but brave. He recognized something important, that silence in the face of evil is a form of complicity. I returned home unsettled, my carefully constructed sense of normalcy shaken by the conversation. For months, I had managed to compartmentalize my experience in the Frank, to treat it as an isolated incident best forgotten. Rebecca's investigation suggested a much larger, more systemic issue, one that had claimed Jake and potentially many others. That night, I finally opened the archived email containing Jake's research. What I found was disturbing in its thoroughness: maps marking suspected locations of hidden facilities, timelines of known disappearances in the region, photographs taken from public records of individuals believed to be involved in extremist activities, and detailed analyses of the symbols we had seen, tracing their origins through various apocalyptic ideologies. Jake had been building a case, methodical and comprehensive, and it had likely gotten him killed. I forwarded the entire file to Rebecca, along with a brief message. Jake would have wanted you to have this. Be careful. Her reply came hours later. Thank you. This helps confirm several connections I've been tracking. I promise to use it responsibly. And yes, I'm always careful. 2 weeks passed without further communication. I returned to my routine, though thoughts of Jake and the bunker intruded more frequently now, stirred by the conversation with Rebecca and my review of Jake's research. Then, on a Wednesday evening, I received a text from an unknown number. Need to meet urgently. Information about Jay same place, tomorrow, 2 p.m. R. The message's brevity and urgency triggered immediate concern. Had Rebecca found something definitive about Jake's fate, or was she herself in danger now? I arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes early, selecting a table with a clear view of both the entrance and the street outside. Rebecca arrived precisely at 2 Reyes, looking considerably more harried than during our previous meeting. She carried no folder this time, just a small notebook that she kept clutched tightly. "Thank you for coming," she said, sitting down and immediately scanning the room. "I wasn't sure if you would." "You said you had information about Jake," I replied. "Of course I came." She nodded, her attention still divided between our conversation and the environment. "Before I share what I've found, I need to be clear about something. After today, we shouldn't have further direct contact, for your safety and mine." A chill ran through me at her words. "What's happened?" "My investigation has attracted attention," she said quietly. "My laptop was stolen from my hotel room 3 days ago, though nothing else of value was taken. And I've noticed consistent surveillance, the same vehicles appearing wherever I go, people photographing me from a distance." "God," I breathed. "Have you gone to the police?" A humorless smile crossed her face. "With what evidence? A stolen laptop could be any random thief. And people taking pictures in public places isn't illegal. Besides, I'm not convinced all local law enforcement would be sympathetic to my concerns." She opened her notebook and pushed it across the table. Inside was a hand-drawn map with several locations marked. "I've confirmed at least 7 active compounds in the region," she explained, keeping her voice low. "Based on Jake's research and my own sources, they appear to be connected. Different cells of the same organization or allied groups with similar objectives." She pointed to a location circled in red. "This is where you and Jake encountered the bunker, and this," her finger moved to another mark about 20 miles away, "is where a hunter reported strange activity 2 months before Jake disappeared. And here," she indicated a third location, "is where search teams found an abandoned campsite they believe belonged to Jake, based on personal items recovered there." I studied the map, noting the proximity of the 3 locations. "You think they found him?" It wasn't a question, but Rebecca nodded anyway. "I think he got too close to something they couldn't allow to be exposed. My source inside federal law enforcement believes these groups are involved in weapons trafficking across the Canadian border. Military-grade hardware, not just hunting rifles." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, suddenly aware of how dangerous this knowledge might be. "Because my article is going to press next week, and when it does, there could be backlash. I wanted you to be prepared, to take precautions." "What kind of precautions? Against what?" She reclaimed her notebook, closing it carefully. "Against the possibility that someone might connect you to Jake's research or my investigation. These groups are meticulous about eliminating perceived threats." The coffee shop suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. I resisted the urge to look over my shoulder to check whether we were being observed even now. "I'm not a threat to anyone," I insisted. "I haven't done anything with what I know." "Rational people would understand that," Rebecca agreed. "But we're not dealing with rational actors here. These are extremists who see conspiracy and danger everywhere. In their worldview, anyone connected to exposure is a potential enemy." She stood, preparing to leave. "I've arranged for the full article to be sent to you when it publishes. After that, I suggest a period of heightened awareness. Change your routines, vary your schedule, be observant of your surroundings. Not forever, just until the attention shifts elsewhere." "This is insane," I said, feeling overwhelmed. "All because we went hiking in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Rebecca replied softly. "Being in the wrong place at the wrong time can change everything." As she turned to leave, I called after her. "Was it worth it? For Jake, I mean. Did his research, his sacrifice make a difference?" She paused, considering the question. "I believe it will. The article incorporates his findings, though I've protected his identity as much as possible. When it publishes, there will be investigations that can't be easily dismissed. For the first time, these groups will face real scrutiny." After she left, I remained at the table, my coffee growing cold as I considered the implications of our conversation. What had begun as a simple hiking trip had expanded into something unrecognizable, a dark web of extremism, trafficking, and violence operating in the shadows of America's wilderness. And somewhere within that web, Jake had been caught, silenced for knowing too much, for seeing what others had missed or ignored. The thought filled me with both grief and a growing sense of responsibility. If his work, his discovery, had indeed been meaningful, then perhaps there was value in ensuring it wasn't forgotten or suppressed. I left the coffee shop with a strange mixture of dread and resolve. Whatever came next, I would face it with open eyes, honoring Jake's memory by refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths, even when that gaze invited danger. The forest that had once been a place of sanctuary had been irreversibly transformed in my mind. But perhaps understanding its darkness was the only way to reclaim what it had taken from us. Not through denial or forgetting, but through confrontation with the truth, however terrifying that truth might be. In the end, that may have been Jake's most important legacy to me. Not our years of shared adventure, but this final lesson. That some journeys, once begun, cannot be abandoned, even when they lead into shadow.